All right. So thank you all so much for joining the Career Center on the last Career Fest event. My name is Mia Santos. My pronouns are she, hers, and I serve as one of the graduate interns over at the Career Center here at USC. This workshop is titled Navigating Corporate Spaces and Leadership Roles as a Woman of Color. And so to provide some structure, because I want to be intentional with the time we have here today, I'm going to start off this workshop by providing context about the current climate of women of color in professional spaces, as well as the data that shows that. And then we're going to transition to learning from our lovely panelists who will provide their expertise on their experiences navigating these kinds of roles. So we have the entire Real You leadership team with us today. We have Nadia De Ala, Claire Lumbag, Joelle Liriano, as well as USC Rossier's very own Professor Amani joining us. And so there will be an opportunity to ask your very own questions. So I'm excited to be sharing the space with all of you here today. So let's go ahead and get started. So what defines a corporate space? This can look very different depending on where you work, but think of it as a space where people come together to work. And so corporate is defined as a large company or a group. And so when you are employed by a company, you are part of that corporate space as an entity, someone who is an extension of the company where you are compensated for the service that you provide. Sounds very equitable, right? And very neutral. The way these systems are, and we'll talk about the data that shows that, in reality, it isn't. Typically, corporate spaces aren't a meritocracy. They're typically designed to maintain order, to maintain the status quo, thus facilitating an experience for employees that aren't really a one-size-fits-all experience. And so what does current data show of women's lived experiences within the workplace? So this data was actually adapted from McKinsey & Company. This is a company whose current revenues is estimated to be at $10 billion. And so they conducted a climate survey in order to determine the percentage of women who felt advocated for when it came to their professional development and promotion opportunities. And so as we can see here, they found that out of all the Black women in the space, only 31% of them said their managers advocated for them for opportunity. Out of all the Hispanic women, only 34%. Out of all the Asian women, 40%. And lastly, out of all the white women, 41% felt advocated for. And so another example of double discrimination can be found in a study conducted by Catalyst, a nonprofit that aims to advocate for women in the workplace by working with different companies and company leaders. And so in 2022, what they found from a total of 333 organizations was that women, especially women of color, were disproportionately represented in manager positions. And so while white women held 32.6% of total management positions, women of color held a very much smaller share. Only 2.7% of them were Asian women, 4.4% were Black women, and 4.3% were Hispanic women. And so in other studies conducted by various organizations advocating for women in the workplace, they found that 9% of women of color held either senior manager or director roles. Now, 6.6% of women of color had held board positions in companies found under the Fortune 500 companies. And for those who may not know, the Fortune 500 is Fortune magazine's annual ranking of the top 500 largest corporations ranked by revenue within the United States. So over like 500 companies, and only 6.6% of those companies hold women of color in these board positions. Lastly, over half of women leave their current companies due to burnout. And so how does this happen? When you are employed, you will gain exposure to what is known as the company's culture. Now, I got these definitions from a video that can be found on our website here at the Career Center, and I think they provide an accurate explanation for what company culture is. So examples of factors to consider include thinking about the way people are treated, yourself as well as your colleagues, the company's values, the company's image, as well as the company's goals. I know when we think about the interview process or our performance as employees, we typically ask ourselves, do I fit in? Do the people here like me? Am I doing a good enough job? But it's also so important to ask yourself, do I want to be here? Do they respect me? And do they respect my values? And so as women of color, it can kind of feel It may feel selfish, right, to ask questions about a company and how they treat their employees, especially because I feel like we always ask, well, we're the ones applying, we're the ones who want this job. But it is also so vital that you use the interview to leverage and expose yourself to the space that you will be working in. You deserve the right to ask these questions. And if the company doesn't feel compelled or they don't want to answer, that's more telling of them and how they work. And so here are a few examples from LinkedIn that can help uncover that company culture. Asking questions like, what are the day-to-day indicators that drive this company and its values? How has the culture enabled employees to perform their best? How do you all foster an open and communicative culture? And what are the different compensated professional development opportunities available? And so those questions are one way of owning your voice. As an employee, it can feel really daunting and intimidating to own and leverage your voice. You might ask yourself, what does it mean to own my narrative? And how do I use that to guide my practice and the work that I do? And so we're going to go and dive into the ways that you all can stand up and advocate for yourself. And so to provide context on why advocating for yourself is so important, it's because social identities like ethnicity, race, and gender all impact career progression, aka moving forward in your career. And study conducted has shown that there are 4 factors impacting employee retention, meaning how long an individual stays in the company and role that they're in. So the first factor, salary, change in salary, the flexibility being offered. So your schedule, if you can work remote, if you could come into the office in person, career progression. Career progression can look like advancing the career ladder, gaining transferable skills and obtaining new industry knowledge through those professional development opportunities and getting compensated for it. And then lastly, one's mental well-being. And so these are the constraints that have disproportionately impacted women of color from benefiting from these types of career advancements. Now, how does that happen? And so we describe this phenomenon as the concrete ceiling. When women were finally able to work and establish their own income, the term glass ceiling was coined. It was defined as an invisible barrier hindering the advancement of women in their professional lives. However, the term concrete was created to become all-encompassing of women with their intersecting social identities and their lived experiences. The reason being, concrete is a lot harder to break through and impossible to see through. And so what are some of the ways in which women of color have challenged this phenomenon? So some of us here may find it really difficult to speak up, whether that's in class, in team meetings, in group projects, especially for those who may be entering the full-time space for the first time. Thinking about not wanting to make a mistake or cause conflict or being a burden are all thoughts that we may have silently internalized. And so the first few tips come from author Helen Wan, who wrote a book called The Partner Track, which is about a first-generation Chinese American woman who becomes the first lawyer in her family. And so Helen has 2 tips. The first is reiterating your idea when someone may try to take credit during a meeting. And second, being firm when redirecting the conversation when you are cut off. On an NPR episode with hosts Stacey Smith and Janet Lee, they suggest also addressing concerns directly or privately with someone that you trust, or amplification. This means connecting with like-minded folks in the room, especially other women of color, and joining forces with them to speak up together. Negotiation is another part, which I will leave for one of our panelists to touch on, but Nadia Da'ala, one of our panelists, stated a question during one of her presentations at a conference that I hope can resonate with all of you. What would be possible for you if you trusted yourself and your intuition? And we'll get to that later in this workshop. Additionally, here at the Career Center, Big Interview has a whole series of videos under their curriculum tab where you can learn more about what negotiating is, what that looks like, how to approach it, and also how to come up with alternative action plans when negotiating. And so one thing I do want to touch on is our inner mindsets. Now, what does this mean? Negotiation can start off by building awareness. Coined by Nadia Da'ala as the 4 hater inner mindsets, these are mindsets that women of color may feel and be impacted by, and how that impacts their ability to negotiate. Therefore, it's really important to build this awareness in order to overcome and avoid these self-sabotaging thoughts. And so the first one is the good girl. Some of us here may be really guilty about wanting to always please others and putting them first. We find ourselves pushing ourselves past our own capacities in order to meet and fulfill the expectations of others. Now, Nadia talks about 3 different lights to kind of explain and describe where one may be. And so I'm going to briefly mention the green lights as a way to see how we can shift these mindsets. So in professional spaces, we have to remember that it's okay to not please everyone. Next is the imposter. Imposter syndrome is real. We feel like we don't either deserve to be where we're at, or we start to doubt our ability and skills, and we may start to compare ourselves. Therefore, we have to normalize making mistakes, because at the end of the day, it's part of the learning process. Next is the victim. Now, the victim is a mindset where you feel like everything is out of your hands. You're like, what's the point of stepping my foot out for change if this is just the way things are? And so, yes, historically, these institutions, whether it's education or the workplace, were not built to serve people like us. However, we want to make sure that we're internalizing the fact that that shouldn't stop us from putting our foots down to try and get our questions answered. Therefore, it's vital to receive criticism and feedback, not with not just grace, but also that curiosity, because that curiosity is what's going to help us with our development and growth as professionals. Next is the toxic femme. This is the last mindset, and this is a mindset where we may feel like we shouldn't speak up because our work is going to speak for ourselves. The fight part of our fight or flight senses kicks in, and it may start to impact the way we hyperfixate on problems rather than solutions. And so Nadia recommends that being able to express your feelings effectively is key. And again, building those conversations around your curiosity over your judgment. And so I will provide a link to the Real You Leadership website, where they have all of their workshops uploaded and hyperlinked if you want to learn more from Nadia about the ways to overcome these mindsets that you may resonate with. And so our last topic will be on burnout. So whether you are a student, you're working part-time, full-time, you have an internship, if you're balancing a lot on your plate, regardless of the roles that you play, burnout is a real and genuine issue. So burnout is a form of exhaustion caused by constantly feeling swamped. It can be thought of as a prolonged response to chronic interpersonal stressors on the job. And so the World Health Organization actually states that there are 3 dimensions to this. First is feelings of energy depletion and exhaustion, the increased mental distance from one's job, so feeling kind of negative and almost cynical when thinking about your job, and then that reduction of professional efficacy. And so current data actually shows that 42% of women and 35% of men in corporate America have felt burnt out in the last few months in 2021. Another research has shown that for every 100 men that leap forward, only 86 women do. And so what are some ways that women of color have challenged this data? And so as we mentioned earlier, amplification allows you to connect with women in your space. So having that social support increases the potential to expand your professional network. Getting involved in mentorship opportunities and reaching out for help and building a community is another option. And so here at USC, there are many opportunities for you to connect. First off, here at the Career Center, we have the Trojan Network. The Trojan Network is an online networking hub where students can reach out and learn from USC alumni and find mentors based on industry, social identity, as well as major. Under the Women's Alumni Association, we have the USC Trojan Women's Network, who is actually putting together the USC Women's Conference this March of 2023. And then lastly, we also have external resources, such as strategies on how to connect on LinkedIn and joining associations such as Raise Women, Fairy God Boss, as well as In Her Sight, available on our website. And so, sometimes we may need advice on how not to get overwhelmed by the smaller tasks. I know I'm someone who kind of gets a little anxious writing back in terms of emails. And so one example provided by Karen Younger, who is actually the founder of We the People, offered her 4 tactics, which are the 4 Ds: delete, do, delegate, and defer. And so delete basically means filtering and cleaning out those old emails that you no longer need. Do, so complete and prioritize the time-pressing emails. Delegate. Sometimes I know it can be really stressful and anxiety-inducing to answer emails you don't know the answers to. And so if you feel like someone else can answer better, it's okay to delegate. And then lastly, defer. So setting aside the time for those emails that may take a little longer to write. Next is the Purple Butterfly podcast. This is a podcast that focuses on topics related to self-care, wellness, and mental health, targeting women of color. And so in an episode titled Preventing Burnout, Setting Boundaries and Listening to Your Body, host Daniel Turner, who is a licensed clinical social worker, invited Tanisha Karajani, who is a marketing strategist, and she suggested that there are different ways that women of color can prevent burnout. First is taking time off. So using that PTO, scheduling those 15 to 20-minute blocks to go for a mindful walk away from the computer during work is one way. Next is taking care of your physical health, having a professional support system, again, mentorship. And then lastly, having a self-care routine in place that works for you. And so to kind of wrap up our presentation, I wanted to provide some resources for all of you. And so for those who have attended, the email has been sent out with the resources that have been mentioned throughout this PowerPoint. And so first off, provided by our panelists, Real You Leadership, they actually have a free 2 freebies for those who may be navigating negotiations with any current jobs or upcoming internships. They have provided a toolkit to help you succeed in navigating those conversations while feeling empowered while doing so. Additionally, they have a market research guide for those who may be in their career exploration era. So they have templates for reaching out to for informational interviews, how to navigate compensation information, and different mindset practices to get you out of those 4 hater inner mindsets. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, the USC Women's Alumni Association is putting together a women's conference this March. It's open to both USC students, alumni, and non-USC students. And so there are different panels and breakout sessions on topics related to women in entrepreneurship roles, how to foster a space of belonging with your colleagues, and combating implicit biases in the workplace, and many other personal and professional, as well as networking opportunities. And so I've also provided a screenshot of their Instagram as well, if you want to keep up to date with the panelists and events that they're going to be hosting during the conference. Their @ is @USC Women's Conference on Instagram. All right, so that wraps up the panel portion. Since this is being recorded the week after, I do want to take time in this recording to shout out our panelists. So unfortunately, Claire Lumbag couldn't be at our workshop. However, we did have Nadia Da'ala. Nadia Da'ala is the founder of Real You Leadership. She is a facilitator, leadership, and negotiation coach supporting BIPOC women and femmes. Claire Lumbag is the client success manager and support coach for Real You Leadership, and she has a background in corporate sales. Joelle Liriano is a marketing strategist at Real You Leadership. And then lastly, we also have Professor Shafiqa Ahmadi, who is currently a professor at Rossier School of Education and is currently the co-director for the USC Center for Education, Identity, and Social Justice. And so we had a great dialogue together at our workshop, and very grateful and happy to have had them participate as panelists. And so that wraps up my Career First workshop. And thank you so much for watching. All right, I think I'm going to stop recording. Okay, bye.